In the year 1220 of the Common Era, as the sun slowly rose over the vast and desolate Kizilkum Desert, casting long shadows across the endless sands and illuminating the towering dunes with golden light that seemed almost peaceful in its beauty. No one in the great cities of Central Asia could have possibly suspected or imagined that paradise on earth was about to transform into absolute hell within a matter of weeks. The morning seemed like any other morning that had come before it for centuries. Merchants preparing their caravans for the day's journey along the Silk Road. Farmers tending their irrigated fields that had produced abundant crops for generations. Scholars studying ancient texts in libraries that held the accumulated wisdom of centuries of learning. The markets were opening, children were playing in the streets, life was continuing as it always had in this prosperous corner of the world. But beneath this surface of normalcy, the seeds of catastrophe had already been planted 2 years earlier, and now the harvest of blood and fire was about to begin. The greatest military machine the world had ever seen was moving westward like an unstoppable force of nature, and nothing would ever be the same again for the people of Central Asia. Samarkand, the precious and glittering jewel of the legendary Silk Road, a magnificent city that the entire world revered and celebrated as the most pleasant, prosperous, and beautiful place in this world, where East met West in a harmonious blend of cultures and religions, now awaited the most brutal and devastating fate in its entire 2,000-year history of continuous habitation and prosperity. The city was truly a wonder of the medieval world. Its population of nearly 2 million made it one of the largest cities on earth, rivaling even Baghdad and Constantinople in size and grandeur. The city's markets were filled with goods from China, silk and porcelain and jade from India, spices and gems and ivory from Persia, carpets and metalwork, and even from distant Europe, furs and amber and precious metals. Its streets echoed with dozens of languages spoken by merchants, scholars, and travelers from across the known world, creating a cosmopolitan atmosphere unlike anywhere else. Its gardens were legendary throughout the Islamic world, fed by an ingenious system of underground canals called qanats that brought water from the mountains and distributed it throughout the city, creating an oasis of green in the desert. Palm trees lined the boulevards, fountains splashed in every square, roses bloomed in private gardens behind high walls. The wealth that flowed through Samarkand from the Silk Road trade had built magnificent mosques with soaring minarets that could be seen from miles away, madrasas where students studied mathematics and astronomy and philosophy, libraries that contained thousands of precious manuscripts copied by hand over centuries, palaces with intricate tilework that dazzled the eye with geometric patterns and calligraphy, and caravanserais where merchants could rest safely with their goods. But all of this splendor, accumulated over 2 millennia of civilization, was about to be tested as never before by an enemy unlike any the city had ever faced. To truly understand why this paradise collapsed so completely and catastrophically, why such a great and seemingly invincible city fell so rapidly to nomadic invaders, we must return 2 years earlier to the precise moment when a fatal and irreversible mistake awakened the demon from the eastern steppes, setting in motion a chain of events that would reshape Central Asia forever. In the year 1218, within the magnificent and opulent palace of Samarkand, with its soaring arches decorated with intricate geometric patterns, brilliant mosaics depicting ancient Persian kings and legendary heroes, and gardens filled with fountains that created a paradise within the palace walls. Shah Muhammad II sat comfortably upon his golden throne, encrusted with precious gems, enormously proud and satisfied with his vast and powerful Khwarezmian Empire that stretched across the heart of Central Asia like a great tapestry. From the shores of the Caspian Sea all the way to the towering mountains of Afghanistan where snow never melted, from the ancient and storied lands of Persia with its rich history to the fertile valleys of Transoxiana that produced abundant crops, all territories and peoples knelt before him in submission and paid him tribute in gold, silver, and goods. His court was filled with poets, musicians, and scholars from across the Islamic world. His treasury overflowed with wealth from the Silk Road trade that passed through his lands. Wealthy and prosperous cities like Bukhara, with its countless minarets reaching toward heaven and its scholars who studied mathematics and astronomy, Urgench, with its bustling markets where caravans from east and west met to trade, and Merv, with its magnificent gardens that were said to rival even those of Baghdad, the brilliant diamonds of the Silk Road that generated immense wealth through trade in silk from China, spices from India, and precious metals from the mountains, all belonged to him and enriched his treasury beyond measure. His army, consisting of hundreds of thousands of fierce and battle-hardened Kipchak Turkish cavalry warriors who had been raised from birth to fight and knew nothing but warfare, was considered Central Asia's most fearsome and formidable military force, unmatched by any neighboring power and respected throughout the region. Shah Muhammad had reason to be confident. His empire had grown through conquest and diplomacy. His cities were protected by thick walls and garrisoned by loyal troops. His wealth seemed inexhaustible. But dangerous arrogance blinds human reason and clouds sound judgment, making even wise men foolish. When a peaceful Mongol merchant caravan of approximately 500 traders arrived at the border city of Otrar, bearing valuable silk from the east woven with intricate patterns, precious gold bars and coins, gleaming silver ingots, and exotic ivory tusks from distant lands to expand profitable trade relations between the two empires and establish regular commerce that would benefit both sides. Governor Inalchuk, a greedy and paranoid man who had been appointed by the Shah, suspecting them baselessly of espionage and treachery, without any real evidence beyond his own irrational fears and desire to seize their goods, ordered their immediate execution without trial or investigation, a flagrant violation of the ancient traditions of hospitality that govern the Silk Road. Blood spilled onto the hot desert sand, staining it dark red, but their anguished dying cries and the profound injustice of their deaths reached the ears of Genghis Khan, the great conqueror who was systematically building the world's largest empire from the distant Mongolian steppes, uniting the nomadic tribes that had once warred endlessly against each other. These were not random traders, but had been sent under his personal protection, and their murder was not just a crime, but an insult to his authority and honor that could not be ignored without appearing weak to his own people. Genghis Khan was not a hasty or impulsive man who acted on emotion or anger alone, despite what his enemies believed. He was a calculated strategist who had risen from nothing to unite the Mongol tribes through a combination of military genius, political cunning, and an understanding of when to fight and when to negotiate. He sent 3 official envoys to Samarkand on a diplomatic mission, formally demanding that the Shah punish the murderous Inalchuq appropriately for this crime against international law, conveying clearly and diplomatically through carefully chosen words that the Mongols were not enemies but potential trading partners seeking peaceful relations that would benefit both empires through commerce. It was a reasonable request, one that any ruler who valued peace would have granted. But Shah Muhammad, in a fit of absolute madness that even his own advisers could not understand, or perhaps foolishly wishing to test the strength and resolve of these supposedly primitive nomads from the East, whom he had heard stories about but never encountered, did the completely unforgivable and unthinkable that violated every law of diplomacy. He executed one envoy outright in public, beheading him in front of witnesses, and sent the mutilated corpse back with the other 2 survivors as a deliberate message of contempt and defiance. It was perhaps the greatest mistake any ruler has ever made. That brutal act was an undeniable declaration of war that could not be taken back or apologized for, and from the east, across the vast steppes, the terrible steel storm began to gather momentum and strength as Genghis Khan called his generals and planned his vengeance. Winter of 1219, over 200,000 Mongol warriors massed systematically at the border of the empire, preparing meticulously for invasion in a display of military organization that Central Asia had never seen before. These were not the primitive and disorganized nomads that Shah Muhammad had contemptuously imagined in his arrogance and ignorance, raiders who would steal some livestock and disappear. This was a sophisticated war machine, forged through decades of brutal conquest across the vast expanse of Asia, with iron discipline that was unbreakable even in the face of death and hardship, sophisticated tactics refined through countless battles against diverse enemies, including the mighty Jin dynasty of China, and most terrifying of all, a dedicated corps of skilled Chinese siege engineers who had been captured and forced into service, carrying powerful catapults capable of hurling massive stones hundreds of feet, massive trebuchets that could reduce the strongest walls to rubble in days, and even experimental gunpowder weapons that could start fires and create explosions that terrified defenders. The Mongol army was divided into units of 10, 100,000, and 10,000, each with clear commanders and responsibilities. Discipline was absolute. Desertion meant death, not just for the soldier, but for his entire unit. Communication was maintained through a system of signal flags and mounted couriers who could ride hundreds of miles in a day. Supply lines were carefully planned, with herds of livestock driven alongside the army to provide food. This was not a horde, but a professional military force that would have impressed even Roman generals of old. Shah Muhammad made his second catastrophic mistake, one that would doom his empire completely and be studied by military historians for centuries as an example of strategic failure. Instead of concentrating his forces together for a decisive battle where his numerical superiority might have mattered and could potentially have stopped the Mongol advance, he dispersed them widely among the various cities across his realm, spreading them thin across hundreds of miles. He thought dismissively that this was merely a typical nomadic raid, the kind Central Asia had seen countless times before over the centuries, from the Huns, the Turks, and other steppe peoples. pillage the countryside for a season, steal some livestock and captives, burn a few villages, then retreat back to the steppes when winter came and supplies ran low. The sturdy walls of the fortified cities, some of which had stood for over 1,000 years and had never been breached, would protect him and his people from any serious harm or conquest. His advisers told him this was a mistake, that the Mongols were different, but he dismissed their concerns. But Genghis Khan was no ordinary nomad chieftain, operating merely on instinct, tradition, and the glory of raiding. He was a military genius who had studied the campaigns of great generals, who understood logistics, who knew that conquering cities required siege equipment and patience, and who had at his disposal the knowledge of Chinese warfare accumulated over millennia. February the 12th, 1220, the absolutely unimaginable occurred that shocked the entire region and defied all military expectations that anyone had about how nomadic armies operated. Instead of advancing predictably through the Dzungarian Gate mountain pass, the obvious and conventional route that every military commander would expect, as Shah Muhammad had confidently predicted, based on conventional military wisdom and the experience of previous invasions throughout history, the massive Mongol army split into 5 separate attacking prongs, advancing from all directions simultaneously in a perfectly coordinated campaign that demonstrated unprecedented organizational capability, and Genghis Khan himself personally led the most daring prong in a move so audacious and unexpected it bordered on complete madness and seemed utterly impossible to any rational observer, crossing 300 grueling miles directly through the supposedly impassable Kizilkum Desert, a harsh and unforgiving place considered absolutely impassable by conventional armies due to the complete lack of water sources and the extreme heat during the day and freezing cold at night. They leaped strategically from oasis to oasis with incredible precision, moving at incredible speed that amazed even seasoned steppe riders, capturing wandering nomads as unwilling guides who revealed the location of hidden water sources that only the local tribesmen knew about. The march through the desert was brutal. Men and horses suffered terribly, but Mongol discipline held firm. They rationed water carefully, traveled at night when possible to avoid the worst heat, and pushed forward relentlessly. And one spring morning, the shocked and terrified people of Bukhara awoke to find Mongol forces already positioned at the city gates, like vengeful ghosts materializing from the empty void, having appeared as if from nowhere overnight while the city slept peacefully. Bukhara, a renowned Islamic cultural center and one of the great cities of the medieval world, with approximately 300,000 inhabitants living within its walls in relative prosperity and safety, containing massive libraries filled with precious manuscripts on mathematics, astronomy, medicine, philosophy, and theology that represented centuries of accumulated knowledge, and magnificent mosques that were architectural marvels admired throughout the Islamic world for their beauty and craftsmanship, was the first primary target of the campaign, chosen deliberately to send a message. The city had stood for over 2,000 years, surviving countless conflicts and changes of dynasty. Its scholars were famous across the Muslim world. Its markets were filled with goods from China to the Mediterranean. Its walls seemed impregnable. When the terrified city's leaders and military commanders looked beyond the thick protective walls and saw the vast sea of Mongol warriors surrounding them on all sides, stretching to the horizon like an endless ocean of horsemen and siege engines. They knew with absolute certainty they had been completely abandoned by their Shah, who had promised to protect them and had collected taxes for precisely this purpose. No reinforcements were coming to their aid from Samarkand or any other city. No hope remained for salvation through outside help. The garrison defenders, brave men but realistic about their chances, decided desperately to break out, attempting to fight through the Mongol cordon in a coordinated cavalry charge at dawn and seek help elsewhere, or at least die fighting rather than starving slowly behind the walls. They didn't get far at all beyond the gates, perhaps a few hundred yards. Mongol cavalry, master archers who had been training since childhood, and could shoot 10 arrows accurately while galloping at full speed without slowing or losing balance, turned them into moving pincushions with their relentless volleys before methodically beheading them one by one and displaying their heads on spears as a warning to anyone else considering resistance. The city surrendered after just 2 days of siege, seeing the futility of further resistance and hoping for mercy. Genghis Khan rode victoriously into the main mosque, the grandest in the city, accompanied by his personal guard of elite warriors, looked at the trembling citizens kneeling before him in absolute terror, with their faces pressed to the ground, and spoke chilling words that froze the blood in their veins and would be remembered and repeated for generations across Central Asia. "I am the punishment of God," he declared in a voice that carried across the silent courtyard where thousands had gathered. "If you had not committed great sins, God would not have sent a punishment like me upon you." It was a statement that combined religious authority with military power, suggesting that their defeat was divinely ordained. 30,000 dead citizens littered the streets when the slaughter was finally finished. Days later, their bodies piled in the squares. The city was thoroughly plundered of all valuables over the course of several days. Gold, silver, precious gems, fine carpets, rare books. Anything of worth was systematically collected. Skilled craftsmen were carefully selected by Mongol officials who went through the population. Blacksmiths, armorers, saddle makers, bow makers, anyone with useful skills, and sent to Mongolia, where their talents would serve the empire in building new cities and equipping new armies. Women and children were enslaved without mercy and distributed among the soldiers as rewards for their service, never to see their homeland again. The remainder of the population, about 5,000 souls who were too weak or old to be useful as slaves or workers, were forced to serve as expendable human fodder for the next assault, to be driven ahead of the army as shields to absorb arrows and make the defenders waste ammunition. Next destination was Samarkand itself, the crown jewel of the empire and the greatest prize. News of Bukhara's catastrophic fall reached Samarkand like a poisonous wind carrying disease and despair through the streets and markets. Refugees streamed in with horrifying tales of the massacre, of the Mongol brutality, of the complete destruction of a city that had seemed impregnable. The people panicked in the streets, rushing to temples and mosques to pray for deliverance, stockpiling food and water in their homes. They looked up anxiously at their formidable walls that were 30 feet high and 10 feet thick, built of baked brick that had withstood centuries, their imposing watchtowers that had never been breached in all of the city's long history. The Zarafshan River flowing through the city's heart like a silver silk ribbon, providing water and life to the gardens and fountains. Surely, they thought, Samarkand was different. Samarkand was greater than Bukhara. Samarkand had walls that had turned back every invader. They placed their trust and hope in the protection of 100,000 warriors garrisoned within the city, surely enough to defend against any attack, no matter how large. These were skilled Turkish cavalry, absolutely loyal ghulams, who had sworn oaths of fealty, equipped with gleaming lamellar armor that shone in the sun and could turn aside arrows and sword blows, wielding sharp shamshir curved swords that could cut through bone and mail with a single stroke, and especially 20 giant war elephants that had been imported from distant India at enormous expense and great difficulty across thousands of miles of dangerous terrain. War elephants. These colossal creatures, standing over 10 feet tall at the shoulder and weighing several tons each, were living siege engines that had crushed enemies in countless previous battles across Asia and were considered virtually invincible on the battlefield. Atop each massive beast was a wooden tower, carefully constructed and balanced, housing skilled archers who could rain death from above with impunity, protected by wooden walls. Their trumpeting alone, a sound that could be heard for miles, could panic horses and break cavalry charges before they even began, sending enemy mounts into uncontrollable terror. Their powerful trunks could swat armed men aside like rag dolls, crushing armor and bone with casual ease, and could even rip down fortifications. Their thick hides could turn aside most arrows and even some spear thrusts. They required enormous amounts of food and water, but Shah Muhammad had spared no expense to maintain them. They were considered the ultimate weapon of the age, the pride and joy of the entire Khwarezmian army, the guarantee of victory in any battle. Military theorists had written entire treatises on how to use war elephants effectively. Commanders from India to Persia studied elephant tactics. They had won battles against seemingly superior forces simply through the psychological terror they inspired. But Shah Muhammad wasn't there to command his forces and inspire his men with his presence. He had fled westward like a coward to save himself, leaving the city to quarreling generals who distrusted each other deeply and competed for authority and status, each man from a different tribe and ethnic group with ancient rivalries. Persians who looked down on the Turks as barbarians, Turks who resented Persian authority and their claims of cultural superiority, and Kangli warriors who trusted neither group and felt excluded from power, all forced to fight together under a banner to which they held no real loyalty or allegiance, united only by fear of the approaching Mongols and by the hope that they might survive if they cooperated. March of 1220, Mongol forces appeared suddenly on both banks of the Zarafshan River, like a nightmare made real, materializing from the landscape. From the north, from the south, from the east, they came like an unstoppable tide that could not be turned back or reasoned with, an ocean of horsemen. Now Genghis Khan was joined by his capable sons, Ogedei and Chagatai, both experienced commanders who had proven themselves in battle, after they had brutally crushed Otrar in a protracted and bloody siege that lasted months and left that city in ruins. The Mongol army that surrounded Samarkand was even larger than the force that had taken Bukhara, swollen with additional troops and fresh supplies. The people of Samarkand stood anxiously on the walls looking down and saw what turned their stomachs and filled them with dread and hopelessness beyond anything they had experienced. 5,000 prisoners from Bukhara, gaunt and exhausted, were driven forward at spear point, carrying false banners and wearing fake armor taken from the dead, creating the clever illusion that the Mongol army was twice its actual size and strength, a psychological tactic designed to break the defender's will. And behind these wretched human shields was the real army waiting patiently for the signal to attack. The steppe's hardest warriors with composite reflex bows made of wood, horn, and sinew that could pierce armor from 200 paces away, with tactics tested and perfected through hundreds of battles against Chinese armies with their crossbows and heavy infantry, Jurchen warriors in their mountains, and countless steppe tribes that had opposed Mongol expansion. Each warrior carried multiple quivers of arrows, a sword, a lance, and supplies for several days. Their horses were small but incredibly tough, able to survive on grass and travel enormous distances. The Mongol logistics system was sophisticated. Herds of reserve horses traveled with the army, ensuring that no warrior was ever without a mount. The siege tightened like a noose around the city's throat, cutting off all escape. Samarkand was completely cut off from the outside world, all roads blocked by Mongol cavalry patrols. No reinforcements would come to save them. No relief force was marching to their aid from any direction. Shah Muhammad was fleeing westward in terror, abandoning his empire and his people to save his own miserable life and leaving his people to their fate, thinking only of his own survival. The third day of the siege, Khwarezmian generals held an emergency council within the city walls, in the palace throne room that was now empty of its ruler. The atmosphere was tense, accusations flew, old rivalries surfaced. They couldn't just sit passively and wait for defeat and starvation to claim them slowly. The walls were indeed sturdy and had never fallen in all the centuries, but the Mongols had erected massive catapults along the perimeter in an arc, each shot shaking the very foundations of the ancient city and creating visible cracks in the walls, and they were building more siege engines every day. Chinese engineers supervised the construction of trebuchets that could hurl rocks weighing hundreds of pounds. They had to do something decisive now, before morale completely collapsed and before the walls were breached. "Attack!" a Turkish general roared to the assembled commanders, his voice echoing off the walls, slamming his fist on the marble table so hard it cracked. "We have 20 war elephants that have never been defeated in any battle. We have 5,000 elite cavalry, the finest in all of Central Asia, men who have trained for war since boyhood. We can smash through their encirclement before it's too late, and scatter them like sheep, break their siege, and force them to retreat." Other generals nodded in agreement. They could not simply wait to die. A Persian commander added that surprise would be on their side. The Mongols would not expect such a bold move. The motion was approved unanimously by desperate men who saw no other option. At dawn the next day, while morning mist still blanketed the fields surrounding the city, creating an eerie atmosphere that muffled sound, the massive city gates burst open dramatically with a deafening crash that could be heard across the battlefield. The elephants' trumpeting rang out like thunder across the plains, a sound that could be heard for miles and announced their coming. The earth literally shook under the enormous weight of the colossal creatures charging forth in a line, their footfalls like drumbeats. Behind them surged a wave of cavalry with long spears gleaming and curved swords flashing in the early dawnlight, shouting battle cries in Turkish and Persian. They charged straight into Mongol ranks with fierce determination and courage, born of desperation, confident that nothing could possibly stop their momentum and weight, that they would break through and victory would be theirs. But Genghis Khan, the master strategist, had defeated far larger armies than this before in his decades of warfare in China and across the steppes, armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands with sophisticated equipment and tactics. He knew exactly what would happen next, had planned for precisely this scenario, and discussed it with his generals. The Mongol front line, composed entirely of the expendable arrow fodder from Bukhara, who had been promised their lives in exchange for this service, and who now faced their doom, shattered like waves crashing against rock, men screaming and dying in the dust and chaos. Blood sprayed everywhere in fountains, bones splintered with sickening sounds that could be heard even above the din of battle and the trumpeting of elephants. The Bukharan prisoners, armed with minimal weapons and wearing whatever scraps of armor they could find, stood no chance against the charging elephants and cavalry. But this was precisely what Genghis Khan wanted to happen, the plan unfolding perfectly according to his design and expectations. Khwarezmian cavalry roared in premature victory, their blood up and battle fury taking hold, pursuing the fleeing enemy deeper into the field, with wild enthusiasm and bloodlust clouding their judgment. They charged farther from the protective walls, farther still, losing all sense of caution in their pursuit and abandoning the mutual support that formation provided. Intoxicated with apparent triumph and the thrill of the chase, believing they were winning a great victory that would break the siege, the massive war elephants crushed everything in their path without mercy, unstoppable like living battering rams that could not be turned. Nothing seemed able to stop their advance or slow them down as they trampled Mongol soldiers underfoot, the handlers on top urging them forward with prods and commands. Then a signal rang out from behind the Mongol ranks, a horn blast that changed everything in an instant, the prearranged signal. From both flanks, hidden carefully in mountain ravines and behind sand dunes for hours, waiting patiently in absolute silence, 3,000 elite Mongol cavalry suddenly emerged at full gallop, fresh and ready, their horses rested. They weren't fleeing at all. They had been luring the enemy into a preset trap from the beginning, the entire retreat carefully orchestrated and rehearsed. It was a classic Mongol tactic that had worked countless times before, the feigned retreat that drew overconfident enemies out of position. "Retreat! Retreat!" Khwarezmian generals screamed desperately, their voices hoarse, as they realized the disaster unfolding before their eyes, understanding too late that they had been deceived. But it was far too late now. The jaws of the trap had sprung shut. Mongol arrows fell like poisonous rain from heaven, thousands and thousands of them darkening the sky. Not ordinary rain, but a concentrated steel storm of death from all directions, each arrow finding its target in armor gaps, in exposed throats, in unprotected eyes, in the joints of armor where the lamellar plates met. Mongol cavalry were trained from childhood in the harsh conditions of the steppe to shoot 10 arrows per minute while galloping at full speed, and they almost never miss their targets, even in the chaos of battle, even from 200 paces away. The discipline was incredible. They maintained formation even while shooting, wheeling in perfect coordination like a single organism. The war elephants, once so fierce in attack and seemingly unstoppable just moments before, when they had charged out of the gates with such confidence, now became a nightmare for their own forces in a cruel twist of irony that the gods seemed to enjoy, turning their greatest weapon into their worst enemy. Stabbed repeatedly by countless arrows that drove them mad with pain and terror beyond any training to control, arrows piercing their eyes, their sensitive trunks, their vulnerable ears, every part of their massive bodies becoming pincushions. They panicked completely beyond any handler's control or ability to calm, turned back toward their own lines in blind terror and pain, and trampled their own Khwarezmian soldiers without discrimination or mercy, crushing men and horses alike under their massive feet that could pulverize bone and armor with each step. The handlers on top, mahouts who had trained these beasts for years and thought they knew them, tried desperately to control them with prods and commands and soothing words, but it was hopeless against such pain and fear. Archers on the elephants' backs fell screaming, killed by the very beast they rode as the wooden towers collapsed and splintered under the violent movement. Some men crushed between the tower and the elephant's back, others thrown to the ground to be trampled. The Mongol encirclement closed tight like a fist around the throat, perfectly coordinated through years of training and practice. They attacked from all directions simultaneously with devastating effectiveness and precision, turning the Khwarezmian army into complete chaos and panic beyond any possibility of recovery or rallying. Screams of dying men begging for mercy, the clashing of weapons, steel on steel, neighing horses in absolute terror trying to escape, and trumpeting elephants in agony merged into hell's symphony that echoed across the plains and could be heard in the city miles away, striking fear into every heart. When the sun finally set that evening, painting the sky red like the blood below in a mockery of beauty, 5,000 Khwarezmian warriors lay dead on the blood-soaked field that had become a graveyard, their bodies scattered across hundreds of yards in grotesque positions. Only a few dozen survivors escaped back to the city on exhausted horses that could barely stand, bearing the catastrophic news of total defeat and the loss of the army's best troops, and all hope of breaking the siege through force. 2 days after that devastating defeat outside the walls that shattered the last hope of relief, morale inside Samarkand completely collapsed, like a dam breaking under too much pressure. The Turkish soldiers, never truly loyal to the Persian Shah, who treated them as inferiors and foreign mercenaries, began whispering among themselves in the barracks and streets, plotting in small groups. "We share the same race and blood as them," they murmured to each other in hushed tones. "We are Turks, like many of the Mongols. Why should we die for someone who's already fled and abandoned us to our fate like cattle?" The sentiment spread through the Turkish contingents like wildfire. Officers tried to maintain discipline but could feel it slipping away. On the 5th day of the siege, the city gates opened wide, not to attack, but to surrender unconditionally to the Mongols without further resistance. Generals in their finest armor, now dusty from the siege, Wealthy merchants with bags of gold and silver to offer as bribes, and learned scholars in their robes emerged together with white flags, kneeling before Genghis Khan in submission, desperately begging mercy for the city and its people, offering tribute and cooperation, willing to say anything to save their lives. Genghis Khan nodded slowly, smiling coldly at the kneeling figures before him, his face unreadable. "You will be spared, Samarkand," he said in a voice that seemed reasonable and merciful. "But those who took up arms against me must pay the price for their resistance and defiance." It was a calculated lie, a deception that he had used before in other cities. Tens of thousands of surrendered soldiers walked out of the city believing their lives would be preserved according to the promise given by the great Khan himself. They laid down their weapons in neat piles as instructed. They were ordered to gather peacefully in a large field outside the city, families watching from the walls and praying. And there, under the merciless March sun that beat down without cloud or shade, they were systematically massacred without warning, the Mongol cavalry surrounding them and cutting them down. Each Mongol soldier had been assigned to kill 24 people as their quota, orders that came directly from Genghis Khan. Their screams rose to heaven in a terrible chorus that lasted for hours, but no one came to save them or intervene, the city watching in horror. Only skilled craftsmen were spared from death and carefully selected by Mongol officials who examined their hands and asked about their trades. Those who made saddles for horses, essential for the cavalry, forged weapons and armor with skill, and potters who made vessels and ceramics for storing food. They were shackled immediately and sent under guard to Mongolia to serve the new empire with their skills, never to return to their homeland or see their families again. Women and children were enslaved and distributed among the soldiers as property. Young men were forced to join the Mongol army as expendable troops for future campaigns. Within the citadel, 2,000 stubborn warriors still refused to surrender their position or accept defeat. They barred the massive gates, holding out in the inner fortress with determination and honor. For a full month they fought for every single inch of ground, every corridor and courtyard. But when Mongol catapults finally broke through the final wall after weeks of bombardment, not one defender survived the assault that followed. They were all put to the sword. There's a curious and unusual detail in this campaign that historians later recorded with genuine surprise and fascination. The 20 war elephants, once Samarkand's pride and ultimate weapon that was supposed to guarantee victory and turn the tide, survived the battle somehow against all odds. They were wounded, arrows still embedded in their thick hides, exhausted from the fighting, but somehow alive despite everything that had happened. Genghis Khan stood before these colossal beasts, regarding them thoughtfully for a long moment with an unreadable expression, his generals waiting to see what he would command. He could kill them easily with a single order, ending them as symbols of Khwarezmian power, or take them to Mongolia as exotic spoils of war to impress his people and demonstrate his conquest of distant lands. But he did something completely unexpected that surprised even his battle-hardened generals who had seen everything. "Be free," he told the elephants, as if they could understand human speech and appreciate mercy, waving his hand in dismissal. Perhaps he respected them as fellow warriors who had fought bravely. Perhaps he saw no point in killing creatures who had only followed their nature. The elephants wandered slowly into the surrounding countryside, seeking food in the war-ravaged lands that had been devastated by the passing armies. No tropical jungles like their homeland in India, no lush vegetation or abundant water, only desert and sparse grassland that provided little nourishment for such massive creatures that needed hundreds of pounds of food daily. Within 2 months of wandering, all 20 died of starvation one by one, collapsing where they walked. Their massive corpses lay scattered across barren fields like monuments commemorating a bygone era that would never return, a reminder of the fallen empire and its vanished glory, bones that would bleach white under the sun. Shah Muhammad II fled westward in absolute terror, heart racing with fear, drenched in sweat and haunted by nightmares of Mongol horsemen. He crossed Khorasan, crossed Persia, riding day and night, each backward glance fearing Mongol cavalry, in relentless pursuit closing the distance behind him. He abandoned his treasury, his palaces, his family, everything. Genghis Khan had sent his 2 best generals, Subutai and Jebe, legendary commanders who had never failed in any mission, with 2,000 elite cavalry, specifically to hunt him down like an animal and bring back his head as proof of his death. They pursued him for thousands of miles across hostile territory. He found temporary refuge on a small desolate island in the Caspian Sea, a barren place with barely enough food or water. There in December 1220, 9 long months after Samarkand's catastrophic fall, Shah Muhammad II, who once ruled a vast empire stretching from India to Persia and commanded hundreds of thousands of soldiers, died alone in loneliness and complete humiliation. Some historians say he died of pneumonia from the cold and damp climate of the island. Others say he died of a broken heart, having witnessed his empire's total collapse and the destruction of everything he had built over decades. His son, Jalal al-Din, a brave and capable warrior who refused to accept defeat, attempted courageously to restore the empire for 11 years afterward, fighting guerrilla campaigns across Persia and even winning some battles. But these were merely the death throes of a dead age, futile resistance against the tide of history. In 1231, Jalal al-Din was killed by Kurdish bandits on a remote mountain road, ambushed and murdered for whatever valuables he carried. The Khwarezmian Empire ceased to exist entirely, wiped from the map as if it had never been, its cities occupied by Mongols or abandoned to the desert. Years later, perhaps a decade or more, when people finally returned to Samarkand after the Mongols moved on to other conquests, they found a ghost city haunted by memories of the dead and echoes of former glory. The population had dropped catastrophically from 2 million souls to just a few thousand survivors who had hidden in cellars and ruins, emerging like ghosts themselves. Once bustling streets were now filled with howling wind and drifting sand, completely empty of life. Magnificent palaces with their intricate mosaics were now mere ruins and rubble, roofs collapsed, walls crumbling. The sophisticated water system that had made the city a garden was destroyed completely, the canals broken and filled with debris, transforming fertile land into desert wasteland where nothing grew. Persian historian Juvaini, born in Khorasan and direct witness to the invasion's aftermath, who traveled through the devastated regions, wrote with heartbreaking anguish that still moves readers today. Bukhara and Samarkand have recovered somewhat, but Khorasan and Persia suffered malignant fever and chronic shivering that will not cease. Every town and village was plundered and massacred repeatedly, so that even if they multiply until the day of judgment, the population will not reach 1/10 of what it was before the invasion struck like divine punishment. Another Central Asian historian, who witnessed the devastation firsthand and interviewed countless survivors, wrote with similar despair and grief that captured the magnitude of the catastrophe. With one blow from the Mongol storm, a once prosperous and thriving world became utterly desolate, and its fertile lands turned to empty desert, and most of the living died in terrible ways, their skin and bones crumbling to dust under the sun, and the mighty and powerful were humbled and broken, and sank into the catastrophe of destruction from which there was no recovery. The chroniclers struggled to find words adequate to describe what they had witnessed. Cities that had stood for millennia were reduced to rubble in weeks. Irrigation systems built over centuries were destroyed in days. Entire populations were eliminated or scattered to the winds. The Silk Road trade that had enriched the region for over 1,000 years was disrupted for decades. Libraries containing irreplaceable manuscripts were burned. Scholars who had preserved ancient knowledge were killed or enslaved. The impact went far beyond mere military defeat. It was the destruction of an entire civilization, a cultural apocalypse that reshaped Central Asia forever. But perhaps the most painful lesson isn't about Genghis Khan's overwhelming strength and military genius that allowed him to conquer half the known world, but Shah Muhammad's critical weakness and failures as a leader that doomed his people. An empire that looked powerful on paper with millions of people living under its rule, hundreds of thousands of troops in its armies, and fortified cities that had never fallen in all their long histories, collapsed in just 2 years due to poor leadership that made one disastrous decision after another, internal division between ethnic groups that prevented unified resistance, and blind arrogance that refused to see reality or acknowledge the true threat until it was far too late to mount an effective defense. Shah Muhammad had dismissed the Mongols as primitive nomads when they were actually the most sophisticated military force of their age. He had scattered his armies when concentration was needed. He had broken diplomatic protocols and murdered envoys when peace was still possible. And finally, he had abandoned his people and fled to save himself when a leader's duty was to stand and fight. Every decision he made was wrong, and millions paid the price for his failures. The psychological impact of the Mongol conquest cannot be overstated. For generations afterward, the mere mention of Mongols would cause terror. Parents would frighten disobedient children with threats that the Mongols would come for them. The speed and totality of the conquest shattered the confidence of the Islamic world. Cities that had thought themselves invincible learned that no walls could protect them from a determined enemy with siege engines and patience. The lesson was clear. In the face of superior strategy, organization, and will, mere numbers and fortifications meant nothing. The Mongol campaigns demonstrated that warfare had evolved beyond simple cavalry charges and sieges. Intelligence gathering, psychological warfare, logistics, combined arms tactics, and strategic deception all played crucial roles. Genghis Khan had created not just an army, but a military system that could adapt to any enemy and overcome any obstacle. As for Samarkand, the paradise that had fallen into hell, the city that had been the jewel of Central Asia, it had to wait another 150 long years, 5 generations, when Timur Tamerlane, himself a Turco-Mongol conqueror who claimed descent from Genghis Khan's lineage, made it his imperial capital in 1370 before the city recovered its glory and magnificence. But it was a different Samarkand entirely, rebuilt from the ground up, built on the bones, blood, and ashes of the old city that had been destroyed so thoroughly. Timur's Samarkand would become even more magnificent than before, with massive mosques and madrasas that still stand today, but it was a new creation, not a continuation. The old Samarkand, the city of Shah Muhammad, died in 1220 and was never resurrected. The new city bore the same name, but was a different entity, populated by different people, with different rulers serving a different empire. And if you go there today on a March night, when the wind blows through the ancient streets, past the great Registan Square with its towering madrasas, people say you can still hear echoes from that terrible spring of 1220. They say you can hear elephants trumpeting in terror and pain, horses neighing as they die, and the cries of 5,000 dead on the field outside the city walls. Those souls who trusted the conqueror's promise, who believed that surrender would save them, only to discover the cruel truth that in war nothing is sacred and promises are made to be broken. No oath is kept when it becomes inconvenient, and no paradise, no matter how beautiful or well defended, lasts forever against the storm of history. The merchants who traded on the Silk Road, the scholars who studied in the libraries, the craftsmen who created beauty, the ordinary people who simply wanted to live their lives, all swept away in a matter of weeks by a force they could not comprehend or resist. The fall of Samarkand stands as one of history's great cautionary tales. It teaches us that arrogance invites disaster, that internal division weakens any state, no matter how powerful it appears, that leaders who abandon their people forfeit any claim to legitimacy, and that even the greatest cities built over centuries can fall in days if the circumstances align against them. It reminds us that civilization is fragile, that the prosperity we take for granted can vanish overnight, and that the price of poor leadership is paid not by the leaders themselves, but by the innocent people they were sworn to protect. Shah Muhammad died alone on an island, but millions suffered for his mistakes. Genghis Khan died in his bed as the ruler of the largest empire the world had ever known. Golden Age ended by arrows and fire and the collapse of walls that were supposed to last forever.